In the early days of the Fire Emblem fandom, Hector was wildly popular for being atypical to what people thought the average Fire Emblem lord was. People thought Hector was cool for being more brash and a violent tough guy, while most Fire Emblem lords were just pretty boys who wanted to be peaceful and goody two-shoes and didn't like violence. Now, this idea has always been flawed. Not only is that description of a Fire Emblem lord wildly inaccurate to the lords that were out at the time, saying Hector is a brute is kinda selling him really short. Hector can be brash and violent, don't get me wrong, but he's also very empathetic and has a lot of very real and relatable struggles going on that make him really engaging. So today, I wanted to look at Hector, a lord that's very popular, but arguably, he's popular for all of the wrong reasons.
There is no meme. This is just a threat.
When talking about Hector, I think it's important to talk about him in the way that he was intended to be seen, and not in the way that most people saw him in FE7, which means starting with his role in Fire Emblem 6, The Binding Blade. The big bad evil Emperor Zephiel was threatening the entire continent of Eel, and Hector was supposed to lead the Lycian army, with Lycia being a collection of small city-states, and Hector leading the largest territory of them all, Ostia. And in his first appearance, he dies! Yeah, Hector in FE6 takes the role of the main character's parent dying, as the main Lord Roy's actual father, Eliwood, isn't dead, he's just sick. So since someone has to die, intelligence systems decided that Hector should die instead, and he dies saying a bunch of plot exposition about dragons that I just mashed the A button through, before wishing to see his daughter Lilina one last time as he tragically succumbs to his wounds. Now, in a series with some fantastically written parent deaths like Grail and Geralt, and some horribly written parent deaths like Lumera and Lumera, Hector sits squarely in the middle. A solid Cornelius and Fado. He gets the job done to start Roy's journey. Nothing more, nothing less, and I think that's fine. Roy being a child is very relevant to the story of Binding Blade and its themes, so they had to come up with a reason for a child to lead an army. Eliwood is sick, Hector is dead, Eric is a douche, and there are no other adults in all of Lycia capable of leading the army. It was just those guys. Hector's role is just to be an Uncle Ben and kickstart the game story. The player doesn't feel any sadness about him dying, or really care about him as a person, but you're not really supposed to in the context of FE6. He had a simple job, and I think he did it well. The only other characterization Hector gets in FE6 is the support between Astolfo and Lilina, where Astolfo mentions how he became a spy in Hector's service. Astolfo was a thief, and like an idiot, he thought that stealing from the Ostian capital would be an easy mark, and he ends up running into Lord Hector himself in the dead of night. Hector didn't even try to stop him. In fact, he was so impressed by Astolfo's ability to infiltrate his castle that he offered him a job as a spy on the spot, asking Astolfo if his life of thievery is ever going to make him happy. Now, the visual of a behemoth like Hector staring down a scrawny thief like Astolfo in the dead of night is hilarious, but Astolfo does the smart thing and runs away in terror, and Hector makes no effort to stop him. But this conversation left an impact on Astolfo, and he ended up going back to Hector the next day and accepted his offer, bookending the neat little backstory for him. This scene does wonders for Lilina's character, as part of her struggle is feeling inadequate to fill Hector's shoes after he dies, and having this story of him being a wise man who can help a downtrodden thief find an honest job as an illegal spy helps sell the idea that she's got her work cut out for her. It also helps show the kind of man Hector was, and in doing so, helps explain why the Ostian Knights, mostly Barth and Astolfo, but also Wendy and Bors, are so fiercely loyal to him. It's just one support, and it doesn't suddenly make him this super complex character, but it does help the motivations of the cast around him, so I think it's still a very solid support. And before we move on, I want to say that Hector is also a recruitable unit in the post-game trial maps. Binding Blade and Path of Radiance both had these maps that unlocked after you beat the game, where you could load up a save file that was on the epilogue and just play through a little more fun map before turning off the game for good. And every time you beat the game, you unlocked a new trial map unit that you could use on those maps and nowhere else. And after beating Fire Emblem 6 3 times, you would unlock Hector. No one gives a shit about the trial maps, no one has ever given a shit about the trial maps, and there's a reason they were abandoned after FE9. But he is in FE6 in this way, and if I tried to say his first playable appearance was in Fire Emblem 7, someone in the comments would actually me. So I'm just throwing this out there. His armor does look really nice though. So with that minimal characterization in Fire Emblem 6, Fire Emblem 7, the Blazing Sword, decides to show off Hector and Eliwood in the protagonist roles, which I think is a very solid idea. Eliwood and Hector are pretty much nothing characters in FE6, and a prequel can expand on them however it wants, because there's not really a character they have to worry about messing up. And in making Hector a likable protagonist in Fire Emblem 7, it can retroactively make his death in FE6 something that really makes the player cry. So it's actually a really good idea for a prequel. Hector's first appearance is a small cameo in Lynn's campaign. I'm only bringing this up because no one ever visits the houses that don't give you items, so I didn't think very many people knew that Hector was in fact in Lynn mode. Hector's first proper appearance has him coming to the aid of his good friend Eliwood, who is under attack by some mercenaries. Classic Fire Emblem Lord stuff. Hector sees that the knight of the kingdom they're in is just watching Eliwood get attacked and sitting on his ass. And after dealing with him in a way that I'm not sure if he killed that guy or not, Hector joins Eliwood in his quest. Hector had heard that Eliwood was looking for his father Elbert, who vanished some time ago, and went off to join Eliwood without a second thought. Now, first impressions are a big deal. For example, Ephraim's character is a lot more than just storming Renval with an army of 4, but that's the most common thing people talk about with him because that's the first thing he did. And Hector's introduction stuck with a lot of people too, for a good reason. Hector did the medieval equivalent of punching a cop because he wasn't doing anything to help his friend getting jumped, and that's something that's immediately likable and easy to get behind. Hector doesn't have any grand motive, he just wants to help Eliwood because that's his homeboy. Nothing more, nothing less, and that kind of true friendship is easy to root for. He also resorts to violence quickly, which isn't a good character trait, but it immediately separates him from both of the lords FE7 has shown the player prior. Lynn and Eliwood are kind people who never really shoot the first shot. Hector's willingness to go in and fight makes him stand out more, and thus, people remember him more because of it. In fact, despite his over-eagerness to fight being a flaw, it makes him more likable. I feel like people like to latch on to messy characters who aren't always a moral paragon, and Hector makes both his flaws and his perks easily understandable from second one. It's a very solid introduction. His character in the early goings of FE7 is simple. While Eliwood is a kind, well-spoken man who appears to be a boring person from the outside eye, Hector is a loudmouth whose brash attitude and lack of any and all social tact muddies his genuinely kind heart and intentions. If this dynamic sounds familiar, it's because it is one of the most tried and true dynamics ever written. If you went back to ancient Egypt and read hieroglyphics, I'm certain you would see a story about two men like this. Hector's teasing brings out a more energetic side to Eliwood, and Eliwood's grace grounds Hector and lets his better qualities show. They work really well together and have some cute moments, like when Eliwood mentions Lady Lynn in passing, and because Eliwood dared to mention that he knows a woman, Hector immediately teases him about his interest being romantic. I am a 27-year-old man, and my friends will still fuck around like that, so it's definitely a very realistic dynamic. Hector's dynamic with Eliwood is simple and easy to understand, but his dynamic with the next Lord Lyn is a little less so. Eliwood has history with Hector. They're good friends since before the start of the game, but with Lyn, you see their first introduction, and Lyn kinda treats Hector cold from the very start and doesn't seem to like him much at all first. It's never directly stated, but her issues stem from how he's a big axe fighter who relies on pure strength, just like the bandits that wiped out Lyn's home. Now, obviously, Hector is no bandit, he can't be blamed for the actions of other men who wield an axe, but that doesn't stop Lyn from having a negative first impression of him. It's only through talking to him and learning about the type of guy he really is that she starts to see him as a friend, and I like that. Not every meeting is buddy-buddy from the start. I like that the two of them have to learn about one another and let their bond grow organically. It's simple, and their bond is never really the focus of Eliwood's tale, it just happens in the background, and I like it. And as for examples of Hector's kindness and true character, those show up all throughout the game's early portions. For example, early on the gang needs to enlist the help of some pirates to reach a dangerous island, and Lyn hates the idea. Once Hector learns about Lyn's past with bandits, he's immediately willing to abandon the idea for her sake. Even though that would make things harder for him, he is ready to support her feelings at the drop of a hat. And later on, when his subordinate Matthew's lover dies, Hector is willing to let him take his time to grieve, even when the fighting that they're doing is the kind of battle Matthew's talents would be useful for. And also, fun fact, that's not really fun at all, if Matthew is dead when Lelia's corpse is discovered, Hector will make sure that her body is taken back to Ostia to be buried with Matthew. Even in their death, Hector's care for his men shines through. Hector is shown constantly to be very empathetic to the people around him, willing to take their burdens immediately and even if it makes his own life harder. A trait that comes into play in a big way as the game progresses. I want to take this time to show off some of his supports, namely his 3 supports with his retainers, Oswin, Matthew, and Sarah. Now, the relationships between Knights and Lord have always been a key part of Fire Emblem. The bond between Alencia and her knights Joffrey, Lucia, and Bastion is a big part of her character. Ephraim's relationship with Kyle and Ford is more akin to brothers than knights. The Lord-Retainer dynamic is the crux of Fates and Engage's roster. This stuff is huge for FE. So, I find it very funny that Hector is given 3 retainers that all manage to consistently annoy the shit out of him. And more than that, they manage to annoy him in 3 unique ways. Oswin acts as a sort of all-knowing parent, tricking Hector into admitting he's going to the arena in his spare time and chastising him for his more boorish habits. Sarah acts like a bratty little sister, constantly annoying him with her haughty attitude and selfish nature. And Matthew is a worrywart older brother, constantly nagging him to make sure he has enough food and never really leaving him alone in general. It's really funny to see Hector constantly lose his patience with these people, and it's not like his retainers are bad people or obnoxious, they're written well, in that they annoy him a lot more than they annoy the audience, so the 3 support chains are all still fun to read. Nothing really laugh out loud funny, but it's enough to make you never stop smiling while you read them. And it also helps that while Hector is annoyed by all of them, he still clearly loves them and cares about them all. Despite Oswin's nagging, Hector respects his words and puts trust in his guidance. Despite Matthew's overprotectiveness, he still cares for him and walks beside him as a trusted ally. Despite Sarah's brattiness, he still humors her. Hell, the one time he's nice to her, she freaks out because she thinks something is wrong, making it clear that there's no actual malice between them, it's just the relationship that they have. All three of his retainers give him a very nice family dynamic, and as any JRPG fan can tell you, we love it when our families are found and not actually by blood, and Hector's relationship with his retainers scratches that itch in a silly, but still effective method. But found family aside, Hector does have real family too. Oh no, not parents. Are you serious? No one has parents in Fire Emblem. Hector's parents died of illness when he was young. He does have an older brother named Uther though, and in a brief scene with them in Eliwood's story, we catch a glimpse of their dynamic. Uther's the mature one, who acts like a sort of father figure to him, and Uther is very much someone Hector respects, as his normal brash attitude vanishes completely when speaking to him. He's a bit more polite. Uther and Hector's relationship in Eliwood mode really just exists for one chapter, but it's the crux of almost all of his unique scenes in Hector's own story, so it kinda just exists as a setup for that. And honestly, there isn't much more Hector does in Eliwood's story that aren't the ideas I've already talked about. His character is effective and likable, but talking more about Eliwood mode Hector would just be me going to random scenes and going, Hector did something funny here, or Hector was a nice guy here. They're good scenes, but I'd just be repeating myself. Fire Emblem 7 isn't like other games in the series with multiple lords. It isn't like Sacred Stones or Three Houses, where all the lords can be main characters, it just depends on which one you pick, and it's not like Gaiden, where it's both Alm and Celica's story, and they both move the narrative equally. Fire Emblem 7 is Eliwood's story. It's his goals and motivations that drive the narrative, and Hector is a supporting character to that. Even in the mode that is Hector mode, he's really not the main character, it's just showing what he was doing while Eliwood was doing his thing sometimes. Moving on to Hector mode, I feel like it's always a gamble whenever games put new content behind a second playthrough. It's known that such a small percentage of people actually beat the games that they play, so you asking that small percentage of people that beat the game to play the game again, and you're just limiting the amount of people that can see it. I am sure that there were FE7 fans, heck, Hector fans specifically, that have never played Hector mode and don't know anything about what's inside of it for him. It'd be like beating Nier Automata and then never playing past the A ending, or watching my videos without subscribing to my Patreon. You could live life that way, but why? That's right, I have a Patreon, where going to patreon.com/FEMSPaint will get you access to benefits for as cheap as $3 a month. You can get your name read aloud on videos, or you can vote in polls to decide future episodes for the channel. Right now, I'm having a poll about some simpler characters because this video was way longer than I should have promised, so we're gonna see how that shapes out. Right now, Hannibal has a slight lead, but that could crumble at any moment. My patrons include the likes of Adebayo Thompson, Andrew Crockett, Bean Juice, Benz Again, Dr. McBackstab, Great Riek, Hell on Heelys, Ichigo D. Camus, Jaeger Guts, Kenpachi Shiro, Uzumaki, Kira Yamato, Kratos, Char Anzel, Frederick Sirius, Balsara Hakuman, The White Void, Justbacito 2, Lysevening Bolt, Marth War Criminal, Morga Lorgan, Played Arrow, Ranger Man Sam, Shen Lu, The Fool, the world's most unironic 8.5 tail stand, Viri the Artist, Walmart Reader, Ya Girl Owen, Brentendo 11, Drew Hack, Fire Emblem Lord, Ginger, Gugu Gaga, Cornelia Milkers 92, Maple Knight, and Upscale Furry Trash. Thank you all for your continued support, and let's get over to Hector mode. With my grand shilling out of the way, we're going to move on to Hector's campaign, where it's honestly mostly comprised of gameplay changes, adding some more maps, some more units, and changing the pre-existing maps slightly, but it does have its story additions here and there. It's mostly that Hector gets a few scenes that will show what he was doing whenever he stepped away from Eliwood, and this can boil down to 3 major points: developing his relationship with Lyn, talking to Oswin about his brother Uther, and the curse of the Armads axe. I'm going to start with Lyn, since her scene happens first in the narrative. There's a scene between Hector and Lyn that takes place on the boat shortly after Lyn has her outburst over pirates that I talked about earlier. Lyn talks to Hector about her sad anime backstory, bringing up how she saw her father get butchered and how that trauma has affected her life ever since. It's a great scene for Lyn's character, but for Hector's character, his reaction is the key here. He turns away from her, saying how he thinks a proud woman like her doesn't want to be seen crying. And at first, Lyn thinks he's mocking her, some kind of "oh, women and their emotions" style sentiment, but that's not it. Hector lost his parents when he was young too, but due to how Lycia operates with a bunch of nobles at each other's neck, he couldn't show weakness in front of other people. So he had to put a tough guy mask over his emotions, never crying in front of anyone. But he wore that mask so long, he no longer knows how to take it off. Now, he can't cry even when he really wants to. So when he saw Lyn starting to cry, he genuinely didn't know how to handle it. And for the first time, Lyn starts to understand the kind of man Hector is. It would have been so easy to make Hector that sort of suck up your tears kind of tough guy, but the game makes it clear he understands the pain people go through and doesn't shame them for their emotions. When Eliwood starts to break down and cry over his father's death, Hector gives him his space to do it. When Lyn starts to cry over her parents, he gives her her space. Having a man like Hector be so empathetic, I think, is very important. A lot of stories have a moral of it's okay to cry, but having that moral come from a big man like Hector is not as common. It tells the player that macho manliness doesn't mean you don't feel sadness. In fact, trying to ignore it just makes things worse. It's a simple lesson, but one that Hector's character teaches very well, and Lyn makes for a great catalyst for it. As for their support chain, while it doesn't have the same emotional beats as their story scenes, it's still a solid line of supports. It has Lyn challenging Hector to a duel and getting her ass handed to her on a silver platter, forcing her to confront her own weakness, and that really bothers her. Hector tries to make her feel better by reassuring her that she's not weak, he's just stronger. Built different, as they say. Constructed in an unorthodox fashion, if you will. His genuine desire to comfort Lyn gets through to her, and it's a nice scene. It's nothing to write home about, but still a solid showcase of both of their characters. What I like more than their supports is their 2 bonus scenes the couple gets in Hector mode if they have an A support, but before I can cover that, I have to cover Uther. His relationship with Uther is expanded upon more in Hector's campaign, showing them fighting with each other over what to do about Eliwood's quest to save his dad. Even when they're fighting though, you can still tell it's out of concern and love for one another. It's a side of them that the player never saw in Eliwood's campaign, but it still feels like a genuine sibling relationship. As Hector leaves though, it's revealed that Uther is sick, and given that he's a parental figure in Japanese media, that means his fate is already sealed. The player pretty much could guess that Uther dies going in. Given how Hector is the Marcus in FE6, something had to happen to Uther. But just because a character's death is predictable, doesn't mean it can't be effective. All throughout Hector's campaign, Oswin gets letters from Uther describing his condition and generally relaying messages back to Hector, but he eventually gets one that he is taken aback by. When Hector sees him, the game shows that he isn't just some dumb brute. He quickly realizes that something's wrong, but he decides to trust Oswin's word and not push the issue. Unfortunately, he was right, and Oswin was lying. He had learned that Uther had died of the same illness that killed Hector's parents, but Oswin kept his mouth shut at Uther's request, and once Hector puts the pieces together, he gets pissed, feeling as though Uther and Oswin didn't trust him when it mattered most, showing a glimpse of self-doubt that exists behind Hector's mask of toughness. But Uther didn't tell Hector because he was untrustworthy, it's the exact opposite. Because he was so trustworthy, Uther couldn't dare tell him. Uther's logic was simple. If Hector learned that his brother was on his deathbed, he would have rushed to his side in an instant, leaving behind Ellawood. And if something happened to Ellawood during that time, Hector would blame himself for the rest of his life. Uther knew this. But if he stayed with Ellawood knowing Uther was dying, then he would blame himself for not being there in Uther's final moments. And Uther decided that the only way for Hector to win that game was to not play it. On his deathbed, Uther only thought of his little brother and what he could do to help him. Okay, so that's a rehash of the plot, but we're not going to be one of those videos that's 2 hours of analysis that's actually just reading the wiki. What does this scene show? This whole ordeal shows more cracks in Hector's tough guy front that he puts up. Just like the scene with Lyn, it shows more depth to his character. It also hits the right angst notes that people love, because Uther's final sacrifice for his brother is such a perfect understanding of him. Hector remarks earlier in the game that he would help Uther no matter the cost, and Uther making this entire plan around knowing that makes it clear that these two knew each other better than anyone else knew them, so Uther's death does that perfect amount of emotional damage. I also might be self-projecting because I also have an older brother, so a really cool dynamic with an older sibling means more to me than it does to others, but it's my video and I get to have my own biases. Thankfully, my brother isn't dying of sickness. His only disease is that he's a 33-year-old man who still collects Funko Pops. So, I mentioned earlier that Lyn had some extra conversations with Hector if she had an A support with him. What's up with that? Shortly after Hector learns of his brother's death, Lyn wants to apologize to Hector for how she's judged him and said mean things about him all the time. So her solution to this is to tell him to punch her in the mouth. Now, the concept of this isn't uncommon. Men solving their issues by thugging it out has been a trope since forever, but Lyn is very much not a man. And call Hector old-fashioned, but he isn't enthused at the idea of hitting a woman, and Lyn tries to get him to go through with it. There's not really too much to analyze, it's not hard to understand why this absurd scenario is comical, but I just wanted to bring it up because I feel like very few people know it exists. And I could make my own joke about this scene, but making a joke about a woman begging a man to beat her would be like a can of sparkling water. Terrible in taste. There's one more scene between the two of them on the final map, taking place after Lyn learns that Uther died. Since she knows Hector couldn't bring himself to cry, she embraces him herself, holding on to him and giving them a quiet moment with each other where they're allowed to be emotionally vulnerable. It's a great bookend to the romance building through the whole game. Normally, they're loud and bombastic, but when it matters, they both can be quiet and understanding. It's a pairing that has its silly moments and one that has its serious moments. I'm not one of those people that play Fire Emblem for shipping, but I still find myself loving this pairing. It shows the best and worst parts of both characters in a way that helps flesh both of them out. It's a 10 out of 10, no notes from me. While I'm on the subject, Hector's other two romantic supports are solid as well. His support with Florina is about her trying to apologize for running him over with her car, and once she finally pulls it off in the A support, Hector appreciates it and tells her he'll watch her back to make sure she doesn't get into more trouble. It's far from a complex support. Hell, they don't even speak to each other until the A support. It's just one that's based on vibes. Hector is the big, loud man, and Florina is the tiny, quiet woman, so you kinda just chuckle at the stark contrast and move on. Not every Fire Emblem pairing needs to have a 36-page thesis on how it connects to Greek fertility. Sometimes a pairing is just something that makes you go, aww, and then you move on with your life, and I feel like this pairing does that well. His third and final lady is Farina, and this one dips its toes into some of the same water as the Lyn pairing. It's about Farina judging Hector unfairly and eventually learning that he's a good guy. Except instead of it being Hector's fighting style that's being judged, it's the fact that he's a noble. Farina greatly distrusts nobility because of her own sad anime backstory, and she keeps thinking Hector is out for her. It also doesn't help that Farina 100% scammed the shit out of him by getting him to fork over 20,000 gold for her. You can legally buy and own Beowulf and Rennek for that price, so she thinks he's after the money he gave her, when in reality he just wants to know what the hell is wrong with this woman. The support is a bit more comical than Hector's other supports, with Farina's banter and wild fantasies getting some laughs, and it ends with her working herself to exhaustion trying to earn her money. It's here that she finally lets her guard down and lets Hector help her. It's a solid support. It's honestly more for Farina's character, to show that behind her greed and snark she's genuinely capable, but Hector does serve as a good character for her to bounce off of. It's a solid support that's worth reading just because Farina's a really funny character. I should do a video on her someday too, shouldn't I? And this last one isn't a romantic support, but it's the last one I have to talk about, so Eliwood. The C support just continues the fun banter that they have in the main story, bouncing off of each other in a fun way to make their friendship feel more real and likable. And the B support is just pure FE6 fan service, with Hector seeing Roy and Lilina in a dream, somehow, and then gets angry at Eliwood because Roy is taking Lilina away, an allusion to their heavily pushed, but we're not gonna say it's canon, romance. It's pure fluff that's lost on English players because they don't know what the fuck a Lilina is, but it's fine, it's silly, it's cute. The A support actually gives some backstory to the two of them, revealing that they first met at an event for the young lords of Lycia. Essentially, it was a medieval equivalent of a bonding exercise for young princes and princesses. It's here that Hector and Eliwood became blood brothers, a ritual where you cut your palm open and shake bloody hands with another man who did the same. People don't really do it anymore, I think, because that's how you spread AIDS at a speed Ronald Reagan would be impressed by, but it's supposed to be an oath of brotherly love, there in sickness and in health for each other. You know, now that I'm saying all of this out loud, am I sure this isn't a romantic support? Hector's devotion to Eliwood comes into play in the last of the story content Hector mode adds for him, the Armads curse. He's given the chance to obtain the legendary axe Armads, where the cost of its power is your life. All who take it are destined to die on the battlefield. No peaceful passings in bed surrounded by loved ones, you're going to die stabbed 37 times. And Hector takes it without hesitation. He doesn't even have a line where he stutters, he's just instantly ready to do it to help Eliwood. Characters that sacrifice themselves are a type of character that people easily latch onto. The idea of making the ultimate sacrifice for your loved ones or beliefs is easily understandable because everyone has someone they love enough to do that, so it just makes Hector more badass and cool that he'd be willing to do that. But, the lore implications for this are so fucking stupid. The Armads is an axe that exists in Fire Emblem 6 and has none of this baggage. All of your axe users will go on to live peaceful lives because it's clear this concept wasn't made with thinking in regards to how it fucks up the lore. They could have easily pulled something out of their ass like they did with Lyn and her personal swords. They could have just made up a new axe. But instead, they just slapped it onto Armads without thinking about how that doesn't make any sense. And God, that really grinds my gears. But, in the scene's defense, it is really cool, so who gives a shit? And it does speak to the emotional center of Hector's character, his friendship with Eliwood. all of the supports, all the cutscenes, and it's all to make their friendship that much more engaging to watch. While the mask of toughness is what lies underneath the surface of his character, what the game puts up front and center is how much he loves and cares about his best friend, and the game nails that incredibly well. Hector has simple concepts that are easy to understand and enjoy, and he has complex emotions that can be related to and understood if you dig deeper. He's more than just a brute, he's more than just emotionally distant, he's Hector. And I hope that this video helped you understand that fact. Now, if you'll excuse me, this episode was really long and I need to relax for the next one. Maybe I should just ignore the Patreon poll and do an episode on Alva. Yeah, the first minute-and-a-half character analysis episode. I would like to thank all of you for making it to the end of another character analysis video. I've actually been battling a 102-degree fever, so if any of my voice sounds off while recording these, I apologize. I would like to thank my buddy Guy, the Green Brigand, for looking over the script and making sure I'm not saying anything too crazy. Thank you very much, buddy. Your work is always appreciated. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and consider checking out my Twitter or Discord. Links to both are below. We like to have fun in my Discord server. You're looking at some people talk about it right now, and I'd really appreciate if you came on in and said hey. So, until next time,